Yale Podcast Network.
Welcome to the YDS Fireside Chats series, sponsored by the Spiritual Formation and Practice of Faith Committee. Since we cannot conduct these chats by the actual fireside in the common room this year, we are offering them as podcasts instead, with a special focus this spring on diverse faith traditions. These fireside chats invite faculty and students to share their faith stories with the YDS community. My name is Christy Stang. I'm a second-year Master of Divinity student, and I am honored to be talking today with Abdul-Rehman Malik, who is an Associate Research Scholar and Lecturer in Islamic Studies here at YDS.
Thank you so much, AR, for joining me this morning to have a conversation about your faith. First off, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your story?
Well, first of all, Christy, thank you so much for this opportunity. And since coming to the Yale Divinity School, I have really appreciated those chances that I've had to speak with colleagues and students about their spiritual journey. And I think over the last 3 years, I've been really introduced, I think, to this concept of spiritual formation, which is so central, I think, in so many Christian traditions, and the way in which Christian traditions describe the processes by which we develop our spiritual muscles, and by which we sort of feed and nourish our spiritual DNA. And it's a kind of a term that I've really come to love, because I find it very expansive and generative, and really allows for a lot of emergence. To use the current woke lingo, a lot of new ways of seeing ourselves as spiritual beings within this created world. I'm the son of immigrants from Pakistan. My father was born in British India before the partition of the subcontinent the partition took place in 1947. My father was born a few years earlier than that, and we came from a region of India called the Punjab. It was only one of two regions in India that was divided in 1947. It was only one of two regions that was divided at the partition of subcontinent. And I think that's an important part of my story, in the sense that both sides of my family, my mother's family and my father's family, both became refugees. They had to leave one side of Punjab, cross this new border into the other side of Punjab, as Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs crossed this imaginary line, which now created two nations. I don't think the trauma of that experience was ever fully recognized in our family. And I mentioned this right at the top because I think in so many ways it's shaped my own story. My beloved grandmother passed away only 2 years ago. She was in her 90s. She was a teenager when partition happened, the young bride of my grandfather, who had a son from a previous marriage, and his previous wife had passed away. And so there was my grandmother, in her late teens, with a son, almost half her age, in my grandfather's village. And my grandfather wasn't there. He used to work in Delhi for the British Army, as a auditor and financial officer, and eventually worked in the Pakistan Army for a short time in the same position. And they had to flee because the village next to theirs had been burned down and attacked, and many people had been murdered. And my grandmother didn't speak about that experience until much later in life, and really at the prodding of her grandchildren, who didn't live in Pakistan, who came from Canada and wanted to ask all the big questions, and not realizing the trauma of this. But my grandmother never shied away from speaking about it, even though it made her sad, and even though few asked her about it, because moving from one side of Punjab to the other, from India to Pakistan, was really part of a total reinvention of themselves and their lives. But there's something about this idea of movement that I think has been a theme, in my life, and that I've been a witness to. My grandfather was a refugee and an immigrant. His son, my father, left Pakistan in the late '60s after doing his commerce degree at the University of Lahore's Haley College of Commerce. He was a political activist. He went to Britain, and in Britain, I think he kind of became the fullness of himself, independent and experiencing, student life in the late 1960s and finding this kind of community of, at that time, would have been called, third world students, who are all sort of engaged in speaking about the post-colonial reality and the movements for liberation. And my dad became a bit of a hippie in 1969, so we call that his missing year. We hear stories from time to time, but eventually ended up coming to Canada in 1971. By accident, really. He was on his way to California and stopped in Toronto and never left. And my mother joined him in 1973, and I was born in 1975. And so Toronto was really my first home, but I always lived with this sense of being someone from many places. The joke was that folks like me have our 2 feet in 4 places at the same time. The idea of being able to switch between languages, cultures, is so natural. The code switching. That we often talk about now is a term given to something that I felt like I always did. I was always switching codes, and I was always, negotiating my brownness, my Muslimness, my child of immigrantness, my minorityness, in a place, Toronto, that of course now is so multicultural, but it wasn't always like that. And we saw Toronto and the greater Toronto area change so much, so that now it's a visible minority majority city, right? It is a city of incredible diversity. The United Nations says the most diverse city on the planet. And faith was such an important part of that feeling of being present in many places at the same time, because the mosque that I went to growing up was one of a few mosques in Toronto at the time. Now there's dozens, as the community has grown so much. But when we went to the Jami Mosque, it was largely a Sunni mosque, but the congregants were from Pakistan and Bangladesh and India and Nigeria and Sri Lanka and Guyana and Trinidad and Jamaica. And they were from Malaysia and Indonesia, and there were Bosnian Muslims and Albanian Muslims and Croatian Muslims, and there were Muslims who were converts, and there was Muslims who were African American and descendants of people who were brought to these shores in chains. And in a way, the mosque modeled this kind of global community bound by faith. And so it wasn't unusual for us to have an imam who was Sudanese, or the imam in the mosque that I went to growing up was of partial Jamaican extraction, African American, was a draft dodger who had fled the Vietnam War and come to Canada in the early 1970s, and eventually went to study in Saudi Arabia and returned and became the imam of our community. And through people like him, we were exposed to, West African culture and history. Imam Bilal, who was another imam in our community, was African American imam who had settled in Canada, and he was connected with the community of Imam W.D. Muhammad, which was the community that came after the death of Elijah Muhammad and was a breakaway from the Nation of Islam. Many would say that he took the Nation of Islam closer to what might be termed, Sunni Islam, or sometimes the word Orthodox is used, and I say it in inverted commas because I have more trouble with those terms now, Orthodox, normative, and so on. But this is the kind of place I grew up in. And for me, that shaped who I was. What also shaped who I was, Christy, and is deeply tied to my religious identity and my faith identity, was the politics of the day. The mid 1970s was the oil crisis. It was a pivotal moment in the struggle for Palestinian rights and recognition. It was a time of incredible violence, the growth of terror violence, both non-state and state-sanctioned. It was a time when we saw Lebanon kind of exploding into a situation that would eventually become civil war. Through the 80s, we witnessed the bombing of Libya by the Reagan administration. I felt like, as a young child, my earliest memories of the world were the Iranian Revolution, and I was in a house in suburban Toronto. It was because for my parents, these events were not far away. They were immediate. It was the conversation in our home. When the uncles and aunties would come over for tea, that's what they would talk about. And of course, tied up in all of that was our relationship with the mosque, was my father's own politics, which were deeply inspired by at that time, and he's come a long way since then, but were at that time inspired by political thinkers who were fusing Islam and politics. So I never saw my religion as merely a confession. Prayer was important in our house. We read the Quran together. My mother first taught me the Quran, then the aunties who I used to go to. We used to go to mosque Saturday and Sunday. During the month of Ramadan, the mosque was like 40 minutes away from our house, but we'd be at the mosque, every night in the month of Ramadan for the extra prayers and so on. So things were deeply tied to community, but in the background, we were hearing what was happening around the world. I remember the winter. It's one of my earliest memories, Christy, of myself and my family. It was the day after Christmas, Boxing Day 1979. The Russians invaded Afghanistan. And I remember it was that day or the day after we were on the streets of Toronto. I was only 4 or 5 years old. Wow. But the memory of being there and hearing the chants, Russians out of Afghanistan, right? Soviet Empire out of Afghanistan, this idea that this place so far away felt so close. And, in the 1980s, as a young man, I would meet some of the leaders of the Mujahideen movement who were supported by the United States government, who fought against the Russian Empire in Afghanistan. And I was like, I met these people. I kind of touched them. I spoke to them. They mentioned things. And so for me, faith was always wrapped up in the cause of a just world. Mm-hmm. And it was never separate. I can't imagine. I don't even think about faith that way, because it was always connected. And then my name, I think, also was you don't realize sometimes how formative one's name is. I think we all go through that moment where we figure out that our names connect us to ancestors, that there's a story behind it. My name, Abdul-Rehman, means slave or servant of the merciful, and the merciful being one of the attributes of the divine. And in the Islamic conception of God, which is radically monotheistic, it is these names, these attributes that give us access to understanding God. And so the most oft repeated attribute of God in the Quran, the most oft repeated attributes in the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, is God referred to as Rahman, is God referred to as the merciful. And so mercy is sort of this emblematic principle, operating force within the Islamic tradition. To be merciful is to connect yourself to the merciful. Mm-hmm. And I think when I've asked my parents why they named me that, because it doesn't follow along the other names in our family. There's actually a pattern with the sons on my father's side of the family, which all refer to actually the prophet. And so each of the names is a reflection of kind of service to the prophet, but I kind of broke that cycle. And I think for my mother, it was really like they lived in such a it was a difficult time. They lived in a studio apartment in downtown Toronto where kids weren't allowed when I was born. And eventually I had to leave because they said, look, you got a child. You can't have children here. It was that kind of time, right? The 1970s. And my father was an accountant, which sounds great, but I think back on it, it was the middle class hustle, and the recessions didn't help, and so on. And I think I'm born into this place. My mother didn't have her family around her. There was this new family, of aunties and uncles. And when I say that, they're not blood relations. They became like blood to us. And I think for my mom, the name Abdul-Rehman, or slave servant of the merciful, was a way of saying, the world is mad, and we're going to need, and you're going to need a lot of mercy in your life to get through. So we're going to give you a name that always reminds you of that. And I think that's in some ways, why I was given that name, and I'm very, very thankful for it. So it to talk that language of formation, I think it's interesting that how much of our spiritual formation begins in our spiritual DNA, in the ways in which we understand, interpret, and reflect, on our own origin stories. And for me, because religion was so active, it was about, of course, ritual and practice and learning, reading. We read voraciously. We have thousands of books at home. I grew up with a home library in languages I couldn't read: Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, Punjabi. My father and mother would read to us in those languages and translate when we didn't need to know. My spoken Urdu is pretty good. My understanding of Punjabi is good, but I'm functionally illiterate. I can't read or write really well in any other language other than English. And so, I think that idea of learning was really important, and spiritual learning was important, but it was never. Spiritual learning was never a reason to push away the other books of literature, books about politics, and I read voraciously, and I think that was also really important. This idea of being able to sit and engage with text. I remember my mom and I, when I was probably like 12 or 13, 14, we used to sit some nights with the Quran, and I'd open up to sections that I was interested in and read the translation and just and the Arabic, and just try to talk it out, without a reference to a scholar or a scholastic work, So this idea of engaging. Now, that to my Christian friends is so normal, but there's something about the Muslim engagement with the Quran that is different, because our understanding of the Quran is that it is the word of God revealed through the agency of the Archangel Gabriel to the heart and soul and body of the Prophet Muhammad, and then given voice in the Arabic language. And so this revealed as an Arabic Quran, but that the Quran itself is the revelation is itself a representation of the words of God, which abide with God in the formal Sunni understanding of that. This is it's often called the uncreated speech of God. So this is essentially part of the divine that is now being given to us. And so the way that Muslims approach revelation in some ways is so different than my Christian friends approach the Bible, where the study and reading of the Bible as a text that is God inspired, but has such a strong human element to it, that one that engages with the humanity of it. For the Muslim, we're engaging with the text for the divinity of it, right? In that as we speak and recite the words of the Quran, we are mimicking, literally mimicking, the angel Gabriel themselves in the utterance to the prophet, who then gives it to his community, right? And that means that the way that a confessional Muslim approaches the Quran is so different. Now, this of course has of course it's part, there's kind of a beautiful sacredness to that act, but there's also then I mean, very frankly, there's a problem, that how do we make this text relevant for ourselves in the time that we live in? Because the text, of course, even though it's revealed in Arabic at a certain period of time, um, you know, not aspires to, but says that it is timeless, and in some ways for all contexts. And so this idea of building this kind of engagement with the Quran, I think, is a challenge for many Muslims. And I really honor, and I don't think my parents were doing it like as part of like a theological plan, right? I don't think they had a theological pedagogy that they were trying to impart, but I think they were lucky enough. Yeah, exactly. But I think, we had curriculum in the mosque. We had teachers who would take us through, texts and through topics, of course. But I think it was part of their own training, that their own teachers from Pakistan were teachers who deeply engaged the Quran in context, and often politically. And I think that was something that was really respected and honored in our house. So I was lucky enough to see the Quran as a kind of a living, breathing text, while engaging, of course, and acknowledging and hopefully trying to live out the sacredness of the text as well. And that led to a lot of activity. There was a lot of activity in the mosque. So I started a youth newspaper. We had youth gatherings. My father would force me on Sunday mornings and drag me out to the study circle that would happen for the adult males. There was a study circle that happened for the adult women as well on Sunday morning, and it would happen in two parts of the mosque, and each way had Quran readings, and they would have their own tutors, and people would go through text, and they would read the life of the prophet, and so on and so forth. But none of the other kids had to come. That's all I have to say. The other kids were in like Sunday school classes, or their classes were after the afternoon prayer, and I used to join them. They would play in the park on Sunday morning. But no, I had 3 hours, as long as I can remember, of sitting with the adults. And at the time, it may have been painful at moments, but I look back on it, and it was a training that has served me really well in my life. The ability to sit someplace for a long period of time, to sit someplace and not even understand the language. This idea that I can sit and people are speaking Arabic and I pick a little bit up, or people are speaking Bengali, like my wife's family, and I pick a little bit of it up, or people are speaking Wolof or Swahili, and I pick very little of it up. But I have this kind of ability just to sit and to listen and to observe and understand the cadence, and that is really goes back to those study circles, right? The ability just to sit for 3 hours and to
be present,
just to be there, and your legs are hurting, and we're sitting cross-legged on the ground, is the traditional way, and all of that. And I think my own sort of political consciousness grew through grade school into high school. And I think my sense of my own faith as really being present in the world also grew. Being a Muslim was not merely being a religious person, but it was to be a political body and a political figure. And this is in the way pre 9/11, but didn't matter really, because I think that in Canada, where I grew up, and here in the United States and elsewhere, world politics, empire, colonization, the post-colonial and decolonial movements, all meant that there was a history of empire, which as Edward Said has described, and Orientalism and others have have elucidated there's a deep animus, I think, towards Islam and Muslims and the Arab world and the Middle East, which came up at various points in time. And I saw that, I think I was witness to that
Mm.
throughout my entire life. And I think part of that I was on a bit of a kick to kind of dispel misunderstandings. And I think I was eager in my youth for a time, to spread the good word, not in a kind of a missionary way, but to introduce people to the reality of Islam. But my father, worked with Jews and Christians and all kinds of people. I remember being young and going to the houses of fellow accountants to my dad. We have this joke that I said, Dad, you since you chose accounting and auditing as your profession, I said, you have either worked with Sicilian Italians or Jewish people. And he's like, you're absolutely right. Because, in Toronto, and this is a bit of an aside, Toronto was known in the 1970s as Hogtown. This was, largely speaking, a WASP town. It was white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. The Irish had been grudgingly accepted at some point. But in the early 1970s, if you were in a profession, there were a lot of doors that were still really closed. And the thought that my dad could get a job in an Anglo firm was almost unheard of. Where people of color went were either to Italian firms or to Jewish firms. And my dad worked for a lot of Jewish firms. And his mentors were all elderly Jewish accountants. And I think for my father, coming from Pakistan, where he wouldn't have engaged with Jewish people, in England, where it would have been limited, he had this amazing and massive education, ending up at Seder dinners. and for us as young people, going to the houses of my father's Jewish partners for for high holidays or for other celebrations, gave me a sense very early of around religious difference, but also how to engage that difference. And in grade school, I remember, this is the old days when in public school they used to celebrate things like Easter, and I went to public schools, state schools all my life. I remember, and there was a guy named Charles, and he was Jewish, and I was Muslim, and I think we were the only two non-Christians in the class, at least those who said so. And I remember we were marking Easter, and Charles was, even as a young guy, it was probably grade 5.
Oh, okay.
And he was a bit outraged. He's like, why are we celebrating Easter? What about Passover? What about the other holidays? Don't you have holidays? I said, yes, I do. And so Charles and I took this to our parents, and Charles's parents came and spoke to the teacher, and my parents came and spoke. And, we celebrated Passover that year in our class, and we celebrated Eid in our class. And I remember my dad and mom coming in and cooking special foods from the Eid time. And my dad had an old, like, those films, like real films,
Mm-hmm.
and he had collected a few from like looking at the Hajj, and so brought those in, and we loaded them onto the school's film projector, and he showed, footage of the Hajj, and it was like a very proud moment, that we were bringing our faith and our culture and introducing it to friends and colleagues in the classroom. So there's always this sense of living in an interreligious world, right? That's part of the
Yep.
that's part of the spiritual DNA, my own spiritual DNA. And being a racial minority and being a religious minority, of course, you got to do that. I mean, this is basic tools for living. You have to know how to engage interreligious difference. But alongside that, you also have to be careful and cautious, at least for me, around what does that difference mean? I don't care what it means for anyone else, to be honest. But what does it mean for me? Is it a source of superiority? Is it is it a source of spiritual arrogance?
Mm.
And I think there was a period in my life where those kinds of messages, through the mosque or youth circles were promoted. And I think there was something triumphant about that. When we watch a debate between a prominent Muslim scholar of the Bible and a televangelist. I remember there was this, I think there's this great debate in the 1980s that happened. I want to say between Jimmy Swaggart, the televangelist, and Ahmed Deedat, who is a South African born preacher, basically a Muslim version of an evangelist for the Quran.
Right.
And I remember that these videos would circulate, and I have this very strong memory, and it's a memory I kind of cringe at now, but I'll share it with you anyways. In full disclosure, I remember it was, we were at one of the Islamic schools. There was full-time Islamic school by the time the 80s, late 80s rolled around, and we were at a youth camp for the weekend, and it was great. It was run by people who I still love and know. And, we've all been on a journey. So this is a snapshot of a world that's changed. But I remember one night we made popcorn, in the kitchen of the school, and we said, okay, it's movie night. So what are we watching? We're watching Ahmed Deedat versus Jimmy Swaggart. And I Christy, it sounds weird, maybe a little odd, but we had our popcorn, we had our fruit juice, we had sweets, and we watched this film of a religious debate. And you know why we were watching? Because even today, I watched it again recently just to remind me of what I had seen. The Muslim preacher basically wipes the floor with Jimmy Swaggart. And the whole thing is about is the Bible God's word? Like, Swaggart is just a bad debater, right? Because to be honest, it's very pedestrian kind of religious analysis. And his Muslim opponent knows that and just exploits it.
Yeah.
But I remember watching that with this group of young men, at the Islamic school, eating popcorn.
Oh, you need the popcorn for that.
And feeling triumphant, Christy. It was like, every time Deedat would score a point, we'd all go, ha ha, high five. We got him, man. We got the Christians on the run.
I love that.
And
it's like the Super Bowl.
Yeah, exactly. And to me now, I cringe at that because I think the ethics of it are so wrong, and I think what it teaches is so wrong. But I also understand it in our context. When you feel like a minority, when you feel unseen, unrecognized, when the politics of the world continuously cites Muslimness and violence, then you're looking for something that's going to take you out of that. And is gonna show you your faith and the tradition that you come from and the people who you hold dear as being triumphant. Yeah. And so it was that triumphalism, and I'm glad I had that experience because it is so not the experience we're trying to give our son of living in a multi-faith world. But we're talking about formation. I think part of that is part of, and to use kind of that Marxist language, is the dialectic of formation. Yeah. That we are constantly engaged in this dialectic, aren't we? That these ideas are put forward, and then we embrace them until they're challenged, and then we step out of it, and then we challenge it ourselves, and we realize that sometimes it's neither nor, and there's another place that we need to go. And another, and I think, this kind of dialectic of our lives needs to be constant. The dialectic can't stop. The constant challenging that we need to do, for ourselves, I think is really vital and important.
Yeah. Well, you've brought up so many powerful themes in telling your story: the movement and spiritual formation and identities, and this dynamic of the politics going along with the prayer. And one other element that I'm curious to hear from you about is how your academic work is informed by your life of faith. I'd be curious to hear you reflect a little bit about that.
I mean, I feel like a unicorn at YDS, as I've expressed to many of my colleagues.
Yeah.
I come at this, and I'm really, I feel privileged and thankful and honored that the school and my colleagues have seen the value of having someone like myself who really, these days they have these terms like professor of practice or teacher of
Mm-hmm.
practice, and when I went to university, um, I entered university in 1993. Um, I went to the University of Toronto. I thought I'd do global affairs, international relations, and failed first year economics, so that wasn't going to fly. I had wanted to be a lawyer. I used to tell people I would be the first Muslim prime minister of Canada. And so I got very active in political work and joined a political party like the Young Democrats, and was very active in politics and ran campaigns and developed that kind of organizing muscle very early in my life. And I think through my late years of high school, I really questioned religion. There was a crisis in our mosque community in the early years of high school, and our mosque, the mosque that I've been to all my life, broke apart, and then broke apart again. And so all of a sudden, this one institution, which contained all these multitudes, became three institutions, and people started to scatter. And that was a real traumatic moment. Actually, it was a real kind of unveiling of the human frailties of people who I trusted and loved and really looked up to. And I think in many ways that really just gave me, I was, yeah, I kind of took a step back. And I remember prayer became very difficult, and I didn't go to Friday prayers. We used to have Friday prayers at our school because we had like three Muslim students, and we'd pray together on
Mm-hmm.
Fridays. And sometimes, we'd have a room open to us for daily prayers, which was very nice. It was a nurse's office, actually. Um, and, uh, and so I think I struggled with faith and community, and I got involved in a lot of other things. I got involved in high school model United Nations, and I got involved in
Mm-hmm.
competitive debating, and one of the few kudos that I can attach to my name is that I was the top ranked high school debater in Canada in my graduating year of high school.
Does not
Um,
surprise me.
and so it was great. It was, that was fun. We got to travel the country, and came to New York in the United
Yeah.
Nations, and went to Harvard for an invitational. And this was all very exciting for a 17-year-old, 18-year-old. And I think, for me, in terms of when I arrived at the University of Toronto, I didn't want to be really engaged with the Muslim community much. I read a lot of novels. I remember I read a lot of Salman Rushdie, interestingly enough, and I had been very active during the 1989-90 Rushdie affair. I had been sort of an active youth voice around, the banning of the novel and its potentially blasphemous content. And so it was funny finding myself a number of years later reading these novels and finding great not only solace in them, but great conversations that I began to have with myself about my own faith and so on. And I think the spiritual muscle, once it's in there, it can get wobbly, but it never goes away. And
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
I took a hard look at faith, and I think came back to faith wholeheartedly, but in a way that was very much around sort of, you know, what was faith to me. It was about service, and it was about justice, and so
Mm-hmm.
that's the kind of work I engaged in on campus. And I soon became an Islamic studies major. I did Middle East and Islamic history, and I also did political philosophy with a focus on contemporary Marxism. And I think the merging of those two is really important. I did a lot of reading into Latin American socialist, Marxist, and communist movements. I read, God, I've read a lot of kind of leftist thinkers. Ended up working, very closely for several years academically with one of kind of the leading leftist, post-Marxist thinkers in Canada, Professor Gad Horowitz, who was a major influence on my own sort of political development. And I joined at that time an Islamic political organization that was really connected to worldwide causes, and something I left a few years later, thank goodness. But that was an educational experience as well. I was always trying to look for, how do I connect my Islam to the big, something consequential. You want your life to have consequence, right? And so you think, how do I connect my life to something consequential? And Islamic learning, was happening, I think, when we got to universities, not in the university classroom, but it was happening really initially, through this kind of opening of this world, right? Like you come from almost like a mosque or a church. And I think Christians probably have very similar experiences, right? You come from a mosque, church, learning about your faith, right? And then all of a sudden you step into the world of theology and philosophy and jurisprudence and legal ethics and Sufism and mysticism. Oh, now it's like the breadth of it opens up, and you feel like,
so expansive.
Yeah. And that I have only been scurrying along the corners or edges of this stuff. And that was for myself and a group of friends, it was like a penny drop moment where we would spend like fun for us was, we knew where the shelves of Islamic studies were, and we would literally start at the beginning and work through books, like picking up books, looking at them, marking down things that we wanted to read. And then when we'd finish, we'd leave like little pieces of paper, so we'd remember that we got to this shelf, and then we pick up another day. We literally went through shelves. It was the way I learned about so many thinkers, because I was clocking, this person's writing about, Henry Chamel's writing about mysticism, and Goldziher is writing about, the development of a certain type of theology or jurisprudence, and someone's right. It started to, we started to develop a kind of a visual genealogy of knowledge as we were studying it. And then I think the pivotal point for me, and I think we talk about this kind of academic spiritual learning and how quickly change can happen. That's the other thing that I've realized. I think we do speak about spiritual formation as process, and I think that's really important. But I think within that process, for many people, and I say for myself, there will be moments of absolute clarity which will not take a lot of time to reach. Some may call it a spiritual experience. Others may call it something else. But I think those moments of clarity, in a way, are what we seek. We struggle with ourselves, with our understanding of God, with our sacred texts, with our communities, in order to kind of get to the point where we feel that we are serving the true purpose of our humanity, and thereby serving our Creator by being of consequence in the world, and by being a means, and in the Islamic language we'd say being by means to bring justice, mercy, compassion, and so on into the world. And that's a process, and that's a struggle, always will be. But then there's moments like you just have absolute clarity. And my moment of clarity happened in December 1995 here in New Haven, Connecticut, of all places. I had been part of this Islamic political movement, had been reading deeply, studying deeply, memorizing a lot of Quran. And I went to the United Kingdom in 1995, and I met people who changed my life and who would become, I went for a visit. It was a cousin's wedding, but I kind of spent time in Muslim London. It was the first time I was really in London. And my dad had spoken about this London of his, this great city where he had so many great memories. And I was this kind of flaneur through London, and through Muslim London, and going to the mosques and the bookshops and the Islamic spaces, meeting with Muslim student leaders, becoming friends with them, staying at their houses, breaking bread day and night with them, having ice cream on Leicester Square with them. I all of a sudden I had this amazing group of friends, and I met the person and the persons who would become mentors to me, my dear friend and mentor, older brother, and father figure, really, in so many ways, Fuad Nahdi, who passed away a year ago of COVID. And it was the beginning of a 25-year-long relationship with him and his wife Homera, who became pivotal in my life. Who became just, yeah. Little did I know how the important role that the friendship with them would be for me. And I remember they were the first ones to challenge these kind of assumptions of political Islam that I had, because I was speaking like a young recruit. I was speaking like a young ideologue, and they were the first ones to really poke at it and prod. And it left me with a feeling of uneasiness. And I came back to Toronto and I started a class in Islamic mystical thought. And I was a bit austere in those days, a little bit Salafi, a little bit Wahhabi. I didn't have a lot of time for the mystical and disputed it, I think, in my heart.
Okay.
And all of a sudden I find myself in a class where we're reading the mystical text, and I saw myself changing. The more I fought against it, the more it loved me. The more I fought against it, the more it embraced me. The more I fought against it, it did kind of spiritual jujitsu with me and threw me down again and again, to the point that I was like, I can't resist it. I need to understand it. And then in 1995, a very dear friend of mine, a journalist at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Nazim Baksh, who was one of my teachers when I was younger as well, and continues to remain a mentor and a very dear friend, he basically said, look, there's a really interesting gathering happening in New Haven, Connecticut. It's 7 days. It's going to take place in this cabin by the woods. He said, I don't have much information. You'll stay at the mosque, but I want you and a few of the guys to go and check it out, because I think a few of the teachers are really exciting, and I've been looking at them and been in correspondence with them. You got to go. So we jumped in his car. There were 4 of us. We drove down in a snowstorm. We drove back in a snowstorm to New Haven, Connecticut. We stayed on George Street at Masjid al-Islam, right here in town, at a time when George Street was more forbidding than it is now. And every day we'd get up in the morning for morning prayers, and we'd drive to this cabin, which I have no idea where it is, but it was within 20 minutes of New Haven. And there was, probably 60, 70 people there, men and women. And we had 3 teachers, one from the Eastern province of Saudi Arabia, and one from Cambridge University, and one from California. And we read texts of theology, of jurisprudence, and of mysticism, spirituality. And it was during that time that we read the works of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, one of the great Muslim theologians and spiritual masters and Sufis, and arguably one of the most important figures in the classical Islamic tradition. And Christy, 7 days.
Yeah.
7 days is all it took. I think by day 3 or 4, I knew that my theological world had basically at that point shattered.
Wow.
And it was being rebuilt in ways that really was beautiful and comfortable. I was being exposed to a 1400-year-old tradition in a way that I really never had been. And I now realize that I had, of course, been exposed to it in so many beautiful ways before. But I don't think I'd ever been exposed to it systematically. In this intensive program where from morning prayers to the evening prayers, we're in classes with only breaks for food, and we're studying texts, and we're engaging with other students, and we're working in the evenings, and we're talking and late into the night, and really challenging ourselves. Like it was a remarkable week. And I came back from that week and I knew my life had changed. I knew I had changed, so much so that my professor, Professor Timothy Giannotti at the University of Toronto, who's now the president of the American Islamic College in Chicago, he said, we're going to be starting our study of Ghazali, and he says, I want you to lead the next 2 classes. And it was a undergraduate seminar, so it was a huge honor, but also very foreboding and kind of terrifying to be able to be put in this position. But he said, you have the readings, you go for it. And I always remember that, because it was such an important pedagogical move for him. He could see that I'd shifted. He could see something was happening in me. And he said, now solidify it. A good teacher does that, pushes you to that edge with compassion and says, you have to do it. You have to go to that place.
Yeah.
And I went to that place, and I think that began a new chapter for me. And I would call it this kind of the chapter of my neo-traditionalist revival. That I really became part of a circle, but actually became part of a a national and international movement of young Muslims seeking to reconnect with this thing called the classical tradition.
Yeah.
And that movement now, you know, so many years later, I see the value of it. Shaped me. It made me who I am. It was about study. You know, we were in study circles 3 days a week. We were in larger study circles once or twice a month. I would spend my summers at 6 week long intensive programs where we would cover texts and Arabic and jurisprudence and sort of live lived kind of Sufi ideals. And then I started organizing as of 1996 with a group of people these intensive programs for others. So running, you know, these programs, you know, 20-hour days at campsites and having people coming just to read classical texts, just to learn from teachers in that classical method. And that's the method, you know, that I embraced. It was the teacher passing it to the student, to the point that the student gains expertise so that they can now pass it to somebody else. So the system of permission, or ijaza, became very much at the heart of this learning. But what also became at the heart of this learning was that relationship with teachers. And of course that can be beautiful and sensitive, but also really, really fraught. But that's the method, you know, that's the way we do it. And, you know, in the Islamic tradition, that really goes back to this divinely ordained system of learning that you know, was embodied in the relationship between the angel Gabriel and the Prophet Muhammad. The angel Gabriel brought the text. The prophet took that text into his soul, his heart, his body, and then was given permission by, you know, God through the angel Gabriel to now transmit that message to others. And then the process continues. The idea of honoring oral tradition alongside the written tradition was really emphasized. So I spent a long time in that world, and alongside that developed my journalism practice, which I'd started in the mid 1990s, and that ramped up to the late 90s. And after 9/11 in particular, I started doing documentary work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I was writing for the Toronto Star before that. And then after moving to the United Kingdom, my wife is a journalist, and we met through a magazine that she worked for in London that I had freelanced for, that was run by these friends who I'd met in 1995. I moved to the UK in 2003 and became a journalist. I did my master's at the London School of Economics and in social policy and voluntary sector organization. But I was really writing and editing and then doing a lot of broadcasting, and then eventually moved almost more exclusively into print and radio. And for the last 10 years, I was in the UK, did almost radio exclusively for the BBC, and that was documentary work and a bit of commentary work, but a lot of documentary and program making. I hosted a segment called Pause for Thought, which was a kind of a daily segment of spiritual reflection on the BBC, which I would do in blocks, like every Friday for 6 weeks, and I'd be off for 6 weeks, and then every Friday for 6 weeks, and I'd do 20 of those a year. And so I was, you know, fairly busy, you know, as a journalist. But then also in the aftermath of the 7th of July 2005 terrorist attacks in London, became part of a group established by my friend and mentor Fuad, called the Radical Middle Way, and that work that was how do we engage with Muslim communities at a time of real theological confusion. And that while we recognize that terrorism occurs for political reasons, it often has the mood music of religion and theology and ideology that you know, pushes it forward. And so for many years, worked in the United Kingdom and traveled the world: Indonesia, Sudan, Pakistan, Mali. We organized in Morocco and other places, working with scholars and religious organizations and youth organizations to create resilience to violent extremism and to challenge interpretations of Islam that gave succor and support to violence, and deeply engaged in that world of you know, countering extremism and countering extremist language, countering extremist ideas. And so that became like an organizing force. So we engage with millions of people around the world. In the United Kingdom, you know, hundreds of thousands over many years. And that work continued and meant that global travel and consultancies with Google and the UN and things like that happened. And so I was doing that. I was had this journalistic life as well, and a particular interest in arts and culture. So that was always a really important part of what I was doing from the late '90s, really. And so, in some ways, I was a teacher. I was a high school history and drama teacher from
Oh, okay.
1999 to 2003. That's probably the last time I had a job, 9 to 5. Everything since then has been lots of 7 to 10s and a lot of juggling, and hustling and making all that happen.
Yeah.
While at the same time, I think, making a choice, and a decision that my Muslim identity, both spiritually, politically, culturally, is important to me, that identity does not limit me. It, in fact, enhances and grows my humanity. I'm inspired by Toni Morrison, who, when asked if she was merely a Black author, responded, to paraphrase, by saying, "Of course, I'm a Black author, and I'm a Black woman author." And that is something that is such a blessing, because I see things and I can write about things and I know things that a white man will never know. And she was all I mean, Toni Morrison in particular, James Baldwin as well. I go back to them a lot, and the African American experience for me, reading the autobiography of Malcolm X was also one of those pivotal light bulb moments in my life. And I think about Morrison's words a lot. They've been so important to me, especially the last few years, because they've just given just me a language. It's her gift to all of us to take her words and to make them our own. But I look to her language and to say that, I can be confidently Muslim. I can be the wholeness of myself, and for that not to be a siloing thing, because we struggled with that all of our lives. Are you a journalist or are you a Muslim journalist? My wife and I used to joke that, when people used to ask us, "What do you do?" we'd say, "Oh, we're Muslim." And they would be like, "No, what do you do?" We'd say, "Exactly, we're Muslim." We were like professional Muslims. There was a time when literally, I cannot tell you, Christy, there were weeks where every day a different media outlet was calling for comment on something, because we were both journalists who were working for a Muslim magazine, who were writing and being out there, and it just became exhausting. You were always commenting on the next terrorist attack, on the next this, on this or that, on whether Muslims are integrating or not. I mean, it was horribly banal, most of it, and then on top of that, it was flattening out, a rich, vibrant experience of faith and life and culture in the United Kingdom, where I was for almost 15 years, and elsewhere. And it was like, is this where the conversation has to stay? But this is the nature of media and knowledge production and information production in our societies. And in those times you question yourself, like, what am I doing? Why am I so bloody Muslim? Is there more to me than that? And then some people come to you, there's got to be more to you than that, AR. There's got to be more to you in that. But I've come to say is that that's the thing that gives me access to the more of me. For me, I'm not imposing that on any Muslim or any person of faith. Everyone will find their own engagement with their faith tradition. But you want to talk about formation? My formation is, I know now the genealogy of it is to the ideas in the heart of people like Morrison and Baldwin, who confidently were Black and owned that experience and celebrated that experience, because that experience contained multitudes. I know that folks like me can do what a lot of our fellow citizens and a lot of our friends cannot. I can have my 2 feet in 4 places at the same time. I can be speaking in one language and thinking in another language. I can be speaking like a Muslim and in my heart and mind be accessing Christian and Jewish and Buddhist wisdom. And that is cool. I can introduced Sufi practice, as I've had in the past, to my friends at the places like the Greenbelt Festival, which I was actively involved in. Greenbelt being a progressive Christian festival in the UK and one of the largest Christian gatherings in the United Kingdom. And I, that was my spiritual home. Like when someone asked me, what's your spiritual home in the UK? Is it a mosque? Is it a Sufi center? I said, no, it's Greenbelt Festival. I go to the Greenbelt Festival. I speak there. I engage with my Christian friends. I'm nourished by that environment of hospitality and welcome and love and God and engagement and holding all of our contradictions. What I've learned from my Christian friends.
Yeah.
How do you hold contradictions?
Mm-hmm.
Part of faithfulness. It's part of what Dr. Rowan Williams in his interfaith work in the early 2000s in some ways taught me, is that we come to the precipice, we come to the edge of questions, and there's what he would call the mysteries in the Anglican language. What happens when you come to the mysteries? What happens after that? We're all in the same place when we get there, Christy. We're all going to get to the end of the mysteries, right? We're all going to get to that point where we look out and there aren't satisfactory answers, and then we have some big decisions to make about the kind of people we're going to be and how we're going to interface with the divine. It's my Christian friends who gave me that language, and teachers, and so in the interfaith work. Exactly, and being with others and be able to speak about those things in the wholeness of myself. So when I say I'm a Muslim, I mean, when I say Muslim, I mean that as a term of expansiveness, as a term of positionality that contains not only complexity, but that contains possibility. And I encourage those who are on the journey, and the journey we're all on, is to allow ourselves to be ourselves on our own terms, and to be part of community on our own terms, and to struggle to be part of community and to find a place for ourselves. But also that I think when faith starts to become something that closes us off from other human beings, there is a problem with our faith. And it's one of the things that I look to Malcolm, Malcolm X, and in his autobiography, he says something really powerful. And to paraphrase, he talks about his journey from the Nation of Islam to what he called Orthodox Sunni Islam. And that's not to discount or to belittle the ongoing value of organizations like the Nation of Islam, or the incredible impact that those organizations had on American life. They are important and vital part of our American history, particularly Black American history and Muslim American history. Those things are important.
Yeah.
But in Malcolm's own spiritual journey, as he moves from the Nation of Islam to what he calls Orthodox Sunni Islam, he says that since coming back from Mecca and having the experiences of the pilgrimage, which were so vital and so powerful in his shaping of the ideas of the human family, he says, my friends have become Black and white, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Democrat and Republican. He says, some of my friends are even Uncle Toms. It was him saying that as he became and entered into his own faith tradition more fully, and began to settle in it, and began to expand in it, and become more confident in it, his capacity to engage and to see broadly increased. And to me, a failure of faith is this: if someone's faith is increasing in confidence and your circle is becoming smaller, it's a failure of your religion, period. I feel categorical about that. And so I'll say it categorically. You have failed in your religion if your confidence in your religion leads you to closing the door to others. Because
that power of connection. So
and what does our religion teach us? The closer we are to God, the closer we are the closer we feel to God, the closer we should feel to the source of mercy. And is it not incumbent upon us, as the Islamic tradition teaches us, the merciful ones are shown mercy by the most merciful.
Mm.
Have mercy to those who are on the earth, and the one who is above the heavens will have mercy upon you. This is
Yeah.
what we are taught. The first statement of the Prophet Muhammad, we are taught when we enter into the system of classical teaching in the Sunni Islamic tradition.
Mhm.
This is the first thing. So if closeness to the divine and confidence in our faith means we are seeking to enter the circle of mercy, and
Yeah.
yet we are unmerciful with others, that we
Mhm.
close the door off, that we stand in judgment,
Yeah.
that we close off conversation, then there's a problem with our religion.
Right.
You know,
Power of connection and mercy. What a
absolutely.
beautiful place to wrap up our conversation. Thank you so much, AR, for your reflections and sharing your many layers of identity and the richness of your narrative. It's been such an honor to talk.
I really appreciate it, Christy, and sorry for droning on
It was
so
so
long.
fascinating. I'm glad you did.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
This has been a Fireside Chat featuring Abdul-Rehman Malik, sponsored by the Spiritual Formation and Practice of Faith Committee. Thank you for listening.
Is between my immigrant parents and their very radically different experiences and commitments as Jews. So I think one of the things that I wanted to know, sort of from my perspective, that it actually doesn't really make a lot of sense to me to frame this conversation in terms of faith, but rather in terms of peoplehood, community, and belonging, because I've always understood my Jewishness in terms of commitments to community, commitments to family, to traditions, to practices, and to ways of moving through the world, and not in terms of faith or belief.
Yeah, that strikes me as very Jewish, and I think also mirrors what I also have to share. So I'm so happy to shift the conversation
Yeah.
towards commitment and experience and peoplehood.
Yes. Well, and so like I think one of the important sort of distinctions there is, the distinction between sort of like an individual salvation narrative versus a kind of like peoplehood and history narrative. And so when you're talking about, Jewishness in terms of belonging and commitments and community and family, and tradition, you can reframe the conversation in terms of history. So history actually plays this really central role in even sort of identity formation and what we might sort of translate culturally into, like, from what, the brief that we've been given to have this conversation of like spiritual formation, I think is more like, how do you see yourself fitting within, a Jewish community, globally, in time and space, in the different sort of worlds you inhabit, in your family, in traditions in your family. And so that's more of how I see it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah,
Like,
I want to hear more
someone
about
tells
your
me, like,
story, and then I'm gonna
yeah.
build on that. That's great.
Okay. I'll tell my story. So, as I said, I was raised in the conservative and Reformed Jewish communities in the Bay Area in Palo Alto, which is a small but international and academically oriented Jewish community. This detail actually really is just like the smallest sliver of the story, because the other part of it has to do with that, big asterisk I mentioned. So my mother was brought up in a very traditional, very strongly identified, one might sort of say modern Orthodox Jewish community in Costa Rica. My mom's parents had fled pogroms in Poland. Sorry, my grandmother's parents had fled pogroms in Poland in the 1920s and moved to Central America. So while my grandmother had grown up in Costa Rica, my grandfather, so my mother's father, he was himself an immigrant to Costa Rica. He was born in British Mandatory Palestine. His own parents were among the initial waves of Eastern European immigrants to Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century. So they themselves fleeing pogroms, in the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire. And my grandfather grew up in Palestine to see the Jewish state born. He was in the Palmach, he fought in the 48 War, and then quickly grew sort of impatient with the limited opportunities, economic opportunities of the young Jewish state. So long story short, he joined his Jewish of Polish descent Costa Rican wife for an exilic, prosperous life in, the small, traditional, insular Jewish community in San Jose, Costa Rica. And my mom herself came to the United States in her 20s as an international college student. So that's my mom. My dad is a completely different story. So he grew up in the Soviet Union for most of his life in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. His parents had actually moved to Uzbekistan during the years of the state-sponsored forced starvations in the Ukraine in the 1930s. And then in the 1960s, the family received permission from the Soviet government to return to Odessa, which is where my family was from. And my father grew up without any practicing Jewish community to speak of, except for his family. Of course, as many know, Judaism was suppressed by the state. Jews who were suspected of practicing Judaism were regularly sent to die in forced labor camps in Siberia. And actually, my father's grandfather was one of those who died in the Gulag. So when my father was about to be drafted to the Soviet military, the whole family applied for an exit visa from the Soviet Union, ostensibly to exit as political refugees for the Jewish state. A previous wave of Jews had actually participated in hunger strikes in the Soviet Union, had risked labor camps themselves to make that opportunity possible for my father and his family. And that is the story actually of how my own husband's father had left the Soviet Union. But anyways, I digress. That's not really part of my own story. So there was a lot of international pressure that made these exit visa applications possible, and it was still pretty risky. So when you applied for an exit visa in the Soviet Union, that meant you would lose your job, your enrollment in college, your ability to receive any benefits from the state. You're losing your citizenship, basically. So that's how my father actually came here, seeking asylum in the United States. Instead of going to the young and warring Jewish state, his family, he and his family, he was in his 20s, sought the stability that was afforded by the long-standing perceived safety and tolerance of Jews in the United States. So why am I long in telling this family story?
Well, I mean, other than the fact that it's such a Jewish story, right? This idea
it is, yes.
Like moving from places and persecution and like,
yes,
it resonates so deeply with me and like the most Jewish people.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that's actually fascinating to me, and one of the things that my husband and I share, that both of us have fathers who fled the Soviet Union. His mother's actually American, and I always looked at sort of like long generations of American Jews as like kind of like fantasy creatures to me almost, because it's almost like this very strange period almost in Jewish history that Jews have been able to live in a kind of like political and economic stability. And it is interesting to me because like I feel like my experience as I always wonder if my time here in the United States is temporary. Just like I always think like I hate to say this like publicly, I guess I'm doing it. I'm not really an American Jew, like I'm a Jew, and then I have American citizenship, but I also have Israeli citizenship, which is another story. But I also have, claims perhaps to Costa Rican citizenship, and I don't feel really tethered to anything. That's sort of like my Jewish experience, like being untethered.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because I mean, my grandparents came here in kind of like the late 1800s, between then and the very beginning of the Second World War. And even which I guess I'm maybe a little bit more American, although I mean, only by, an extra 100 years, maybe. I've started to like have that same feeling in the last few years in a way that I'd never imagined, of like beginning to think like, okay, at what point do I and my family, like, at what point do we get up and leave and go somewhere else? because anti-Semitism is happening again. And it's a really,
Yeah.
it's a really scary thought to begin to see patterns in history that really remind me of Germany in the early 1900s, mid 1900s, and like that feeling of being an American Jew, but like starting to question what that American piece means, has been a really scary experience for me in the last few years. And it just seems like we're maybe meeting at this point of this insider outsider.
Yeah.
Question.
I mean, I think it's actually this is why I feel like the family history is so central to a feeling of Jewishness, because it's both about, I mean, my search has always been about like the community. I'm always perpetually in search and not finding a place where I feel like I fit. And there's obviously a lot of really important reasons, right? Like, why did I tell this whole long story, right? Like you couldn't have two more contrasting Jewish experiences in terms of belonging. My mom with her very strong Jewish identity cultivated in, her practicing community, which was insular and provincial, but safe, right? And then, my dad with no formal Jewish education, right, experiencing persistent oppression and suppression of Jewishness his whole life. Just to sort of like illustrate the point, my father's parents, my grandparents, illegally and secretly held their Jewish wedding ceremony in their living room with the blinds drawn and only the closest of family members present. So, I mean, that's not a million years ago, that's in recent memory. And, I don't feel like I'm being alarmist when I say, I can feel the rise of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is actually it's part of what it means to be Jewish. It's that history and that experience. Right? Like it's this whole thing about like, if I set aside the idea of like, faith, right? I don't want to talk about faith, right? Because if I were to say like my entire experience within the Jewish community, right? In my religious education, at key moments in the life cycle, my bat mitzvah, my first wedding, I was married before, my subsequent divorce, right? I was married in the Rabbanut.
Get out! We really are! This divorced.
Right. So I was married like Orthodox, right? I had to get a get, by the rabbinic court of Los Angeles. Then my next wedding.
We'll share our stories of getting a get is a document of Jewish divorce. We'll share those stories.
Yeah. I mean that I would say like I actually hadn't even planned on bringing it up, but it actually is this kind of weird moment in my Jewish identity where that along with like a few other moments where I just, I cannot throw myself into Jewish practice because I feel persistently like I cannot make enough apologies to accept that I don't belong as much as a man. And to me, that's just, it's the stumbling block always for me. And I can't get past it. And I know there's other people who can provide a whole set of rationale for the way they live their life, and I would never judge them, but I can't get over it. And
I totally empathize. I find it so fascinating because I very much feel like I have continued to live within the Orthodox community and try to do that work and like manage and process these exact feelings of being in a religious leadership role in a community, but I'm not a rabbi and I can't be. And that's why I'm at Yale Divinity School, because there are no institutions of higher learning within my community that can train me to do the job that I'm doing. And so, but I still want to do it. And so I'm leaving my community in order to come back. And like, also constantly feel like for my whole life, I've been navigating this question of what it means to be a Jewish woman and how that impacts my practice and I feel like that is very much something that's on my mind and on my heart all the time. Like when you talk about ancestors, when I think about my ancestors, I frame it in this reality that like I come from a long, long line of rabbis, that like the people in my family for generations and generations and generations, my father, my grandfather, like the men in my family are rabbis. And that's this amazing glorified position. And like, I know that if I was born a boy, that I would be the next rabbi in the generation, like in the line, and trying to come to terms with what it means to see myself as a Jew, as part of my history, and connect also as a woman when the things that speak the most to me about my community and my tradition don't jive so smoothly with being a traditional Jewish woman. And that's been kind of where I've navigated. It also was something I thought a lot about when I got divorced. It's something I think a lot about when I teach. And when I started learning Talmud, which is Jewish law, which is an area of study that I was denied for my whole formal, 13 years of Jewish schooling, and trying to feel like I'm always playing catch up so that I could like sit at the same table. But then also like trying to recognize that hopefully if I do a good job and other people follow me and work with me, that we won't have young women who feel the way that we have felt. And maybe that's my dream. But that it's just interesting to like reflect on that in contrast, but also I feel like parallel to what you're sharing.
I wonder if you and I had the same experience of watching Yentl over and over again.
I did, because I wasn't allowed to watch TV and movies.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't watch Yentl, but I know Yentl because Yentl is in my heart. For those of us who are listening, who don't know the story of Yentl is a story. It's Barbara Streisand. It's an amazing movie. Everyone should watch it. She wants to learn Talmud. She wants to learn Jewish law. And so she dresses up and pretends to be a boy so that she could go to yeshiva. And it's so striking to me because I grew up reading Tamora Pierce, who like wrote these fantasy novels about girls who dressed up to go become knights. They pretended to be boys and they went to the castle to become a knight. And it's the same story. It's the story of an amazing woman who can do it and who needs to like lie about who she is in order so that she
exactly
was born to do. And like, oh, it speaks to my soul.
Yeah. So I mean, I would say like there was a moment. The moment I usually identify as when I had to. My family, we went to Costa Rica fairly often to visit family, and we went for my cousin's bar mitzvah, and I had no context for understanding, what an Orthodox, that men and women sit apart. I just didn't know. And in this synagogue, the women sat upstairs. I just didn't know. I think it was like 10. But we walk into the synagogue and the usher tells me in Spanish probably, that I have to go upstairs to sit with my mom. And I'm just running after my dad who probably doesn't even want to be there, right? But I'm running after my dad and I'm just saying, like, I want to go and sit with you, and, he, everyone's just sort of like, okay, Jack, you have to go upstairs. I think I, at one point, probably had some harsh words for the usher who was totally confused, but I just, I think I said something like, show me the text where it's written where I have to sit upstairs. But, I sat upstairs the rest of the service. I was so mad. I mean, I think I asked my mom, did they deny you from reading from the Torah too when you were growing up? And I remember like the moment where we're like throwing candy at my cousin, and I'm just so mad. I'm just like pelting those like pieces of candy.
Love about that story is that you're already asking the usher about the text.
Yes.
You're like already reading the text. You're like, let's talk about the Jewish text here.
I was so mad. I felt like I wasn't even given a chance, and I think that moment, I think something broke in me in that moment where I was just like, I don't even have access, like even if I could, even if I wanted to. And I think that's where I started having these sort of fantasies of studying Jewish texts that I thought like, if I just can figure them out, if I can figure them out and if I can be smarter than anyone else and can understand the languages, that maybe I would find a way to figure out where I fit. You know, if I read the texts hard enough and I make sense of them enough, I'll figure out where I fit. And I think that sort of morphed into, then it sort of became, well, I don't see myself in these texts. So I'm going to keep digging older and older and older until I get to what is the oldest text. I mean, thankfully, I've moved away from that kind of thinking. But I think that is what sort of brought me to the biblical texts, because it felt untouched in a way that, even though it kind of struck me that, like, the Hebrew Bible, in a sense, and more so the Ketuvim than any other of the texts, are almost claimed by no one. You know, they're almost orphaned in a sense, because they're not a central part of Jewish liturgy or practice. I mean, like, of course, yes, they show up in liturgy, but that's not my point. You know, it's not Jewish law, it's not Talmud, it's not the center of sort of how Jewish experience is sort of like centers around, Jewish learning centers around. So I think that's where I sort of like lost myself in there. And I was like, I'm just gonna be here.
Funny. I feel like I mentioned, like, coming to Talmud and studying Jewish law at a late. I feel like I committed myself for the last 10 years to really study Talmud and learn how to do it. And I wonder if I'll ever be able to get away from this, like, inferiority complex of, like, I'm not pronouncing the words the same way the guys that grew up in yeshiva since forever, like the same way that they do it. And only very recently, and I'm so proud and excited about this experience, only recently has this, like, voice awakened in me where it's like, well, maybe this is a right way to do it also. And maybe there can be, like, it is now time for there to be women Talmud scholars who can learn this text and dig through it to find themselves, and to make it their own. And I think it's a different kind of battle than the one, you mentioned. But it constantly feels like I'm navigating this internal voice of, like, I'm not here. Why am I not here? And then being able to say, like, no, I'm here because I'm here and I can make myself be here and I belong. Yeah.
I mean, I think the thing that's so striking, I feel like, when I tell this story, is that, it's almost like I was escaping to biblical studies because I felt like I couldn't belong in Jewish text study, and I couldn't belong religiously, and I couldn't belong in terms of practice and community. I just didn't find myself there. And what is so almost ironic and hilarious about it is that I definitely don't belong in biblical studies. It's like, what was I thinking? That I was leaving sort of, like, I was leaving, one sort of Yentl situation for another Yentl situation, where I don't know the pathways, the sort of the social landscape even more, just because biblical studies has been dominated for so long by Protestant theology. So it's also a foreign land to me. And I might even say, even for, I do sometimes find refuge in the various sort of philologically inclined Jewish scholars in the field, just because I often see, eye to eye on certain approaches. But even there, I also feel like they all share this experience. These men share this experience of having gone to yeshiva together. And I don't have that. I didn't go to yeshiva. I didn't have that opportunity. And even if I went to, like, Beis Yaakov, it would have been different anyways.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's so funny. I feel similarly. I mean, obviously, I'm not, officially in the field of Bible study, but even my experience taking academic Bible in my years here at YDS, I like know Bible. I had like 13 years of actually 16 because I went to a Jewish college that required Bible study. I have years of Bible study, except it's totally not the same thing. Like I can read the text in Hebrew and I know what all the commentaries and the medieval commentaries for years and years and years back say about things. And yet there are like conversations happening that I can't quite understand. And there is almost like a concern of like loss of ownership of a text that like that is mine and I own, but then it feels so foreign to me when it's articulated in this very like white male Protestant language. And I'm like, are we talking about the same book right now?
It's like, you're missing a midrash on, like I used to it doesn't happen so often anymore, but, early on, I think it was probably in my master's, when we would read a text, I would have a different memory of the text and, we would be discussing a text, and I would think, wait, I'm remembering this text differently. And then I'd realize that what I was remembering was some midrash that I had learned alongside the text.
You're like, wait, that's not actually in the Bible? Like that's not in the text? Yeah, I've had the same experience. And then
Moses didn't put the hot coals in his mouth?
Exactly. For me, it was Abraham being thrown into the furnace. I was like, I'm sure I skipped this part. Like it goes straight from chapter 10 to chapter 11, but I'm pretty sure there's supposed to be a 10.5. Like, it's so funny because then I feel like I go through this experience of being like, oh, that's not in the text. That's not really true. And then like to have that be denied as like valid interpretation or study. And then to fight back and say like, no, why isn't like rabbinic interpretation, like early rabbinic interpretation and midrash, like, why isn't that also a form of valid interpretation of reading and thinking about the nuance of the text? And it is mastery, the things, the textual details and themes that are talked about in the midrash are the same themes that we're picking up on now as if we just discovered them. But like, like they had it back then.
Yeah, it is. I think that for me, one of the things that keeps me feeling like I'm in exile perpetually is that I can't even sort of claim any sort of specific Jewish community as mine either. And I think a little bit of that comes from my dad and it's funny because if you were to ask him, like you could meet him now and hear his Russian accent and folks will say, are you Russian? And he'll say, no, I'm Jewish, because they spent all of their lives in the Soviet Union fending off accusations that they were Jews and not Russians, not Soviet citizens, and then to come here and then people say, well, are you Russian? It's just like, wait, what? And I think a little bit of that sort of like displacement, the way I dealt with, not feeling totally comfortable, sort of shedding, my identity in, giving up a little bit of who I am through sort of subordinating myself in a kind of patriarchal system. The way I dealt with it was I thought, you know what, I'm going to make Aliyah and I'm going to be Israeli now. And therefore I will claim a kind of Jewish nationalism, a secular Jewish nationalism, and I won't be bound to any sort of questions of, should I practice or do I need to practice to continue to feel like I belong? And even that didn't work, just because I think that ethical questions about what it means for there to be a Jewish nationalism started to creep up on me, and I just couldn't maintain that ethically, and so I just knew that it wasn't really the right place. I didn't fit there either. And then I think the funniest part of all of this is that when my husband says that when I finally got my first position at Brandeis, he said, here, now you can solve your Jewish identity problem. You can be a professor at Brandeis.
Professor at Brandeis.
Right? It's like, here, Jackie, you've solved your Jewish identity problem. And then, I mean, which betrays a complete lack of knowledge of the kind of, conflicting, sort of overlapping identities that are experienced by faculty at Brandeis. I mean, what does it mean to be a faculty member at Brandeis is like to really struggle with the question of Jewish identity in like the most acute way possible. So I think it was a little naive of my husband to say, here, this is going to solve your problem.
If we do know anything, there's never going to be one thing to solve this problem.
No, but it was, I did find it a little bit hilarious. To me, one of the most interesting experiences so far, I guess, as living my life Jewishly, has been to be this kind of like, to take a kind of leadership role, like an intellectual leadership role in a Christian identified divinity school. And I've worked really hard not to be like, I'm not a token Jew. I'm me. I am who I am. Not to quote the Bible here, but I am me, and I am Jewish. But it is, being Jewish is not one thing, and it's a complex sort of set of overlapping identities. But I also appreciate that it's an opportunity to be able to show people who might not understand, what it means to interface the Bible not as a Christian. And that's been an important experience for me.
That's awesome. Should I go back to I'll rewind all bits and pieces already through our conversation. But so I mentioned my ancestors, my rabbinic line, that I grew up, I was born into and was raised, and I'm still a part of the Orthodox Jewish community. I went to a Jewish day camp, a Jewish elementary school, middle school, all girls, Jewish high school. I took a gap year studying in seminary in Israel at an Orthodox all girls seminary. I went to Stern College, Yeshiva University, which is an all girls Jewish college. And I was like, I still am, but like just such a goody two shoes. Like I loved my community. I followed all the rules. It was knee socks, shirts to my elbows, skirts to my knees, collarbone covered, like, and I just loved my Judaism. I loved Jewish texts. I always loved studying Judaics. And I loved Jewish practice. Like it was just such a big part of who I was. And I think the fact that I was in all girls spaces, basically my whole life until after college, the gender thing, like it came up, but it just never really occurred to me because I wasn't around men very frequently. And so I was just like doing my thing in my own happy little universe. And I knew that I wanted to teach Bible and Jewish practice and Jewish philosophy. I was like totally a teacher. And this is the way that women go. Like when women have the qualities to become rabbis, they become high school teachers. That's like what we did. So I started training in college. I did my degree in Jewish education. And part of that, that program was fieldwork and internship experience. And I was placed, my first fieldwork placement was at the Abraham Joshua Heschel High School, which is a pluralistic Jewish day school on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And it was my first time ever spending serious time, I think like really ever meeting Jews, anyone who wasn't Orthodox. Like I had grown up so sheltered. And it blew my mind. I remember after my first day of observation, I had seen like a Bible class and I walked to the subway crying my eyes out because I was so confused. Like I was taught, not that anyone necessarily explicitly said this, but I was kind of like led to believe that Orthodox Jews are doing this right. And people who are not Orthodox Jews are just either not trying hard enough and like don't care enough, or are just like radically misinformed. And like that just didn't jive with what I was seeing. And it blew my mind, and I ended up falling in love with the school. I never left, even after my fieldwork hours were done. And they ended up hiring me, and I taught there for 7 years. And that was a really transformative experience. Before I started, I would not call myself a feminist. I was asked to facilitate a prayer group, like the women's prayer group. And I was like, okay, but like, I'm not a feminist. Like, I don't think feminist is a feminist dirty word. And then after my first year of being in these women's spaces and like thinking about myself differently, I'm like, of course I'm a feminist. What's wrong with this? And like, it totally broke me out of, even though I stayed, I lived in the Orthodox community. I continue to affiliate Orthodox, and my practice is an Orthodox practice. I just was like, there's something not right here. And I started teaching in congregational settings, just teaching adult education classes. And then they invited me back, and I would go for the weekend for Shabbat, and I would give a speech. And then I started going every weekend. And so then I was there, and I was their community educator, and I was going every weekend, and I was giving a sermon, and I was teaching a class, and I was like facilitating a prayer service. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I just gave the job description of a rabbi. Like, yeah. Why am I not a rabbi? And the answer was because I didn't go to rabbinical school, but there was no rabbinical school for me to go to. And so I found myself in this like feminine space that is brand new in my community that really has come about in the last few years. We're talking about
is this Maharat?
Well, so in the last few years, like literally when I was in college, the first Maharat was ordained. A Maharat is from a school who ordained women as Orthodox communal leaders, some of whom take the title rabbi. And this created a huge split in my community, in the modern Orthodox community, of people who were accepting of this kind of title giving and people who weren't. And I had grown up on the side of the tracks, I guess you could say, that was firmly opposed. And yet, because these women had taken this step, more mainstream, more traditional Orthodox synagogues were like, okay, well, we could have women teach some kinds of classes. And that's where I am now. I'm in these positions that have been created out of a genuine recognized need in the Orthodox community for not just need for women leaders, but just a recognition of the capacity that like there are brilliant, smart, passionate, capable women who have what to say and to teach. And we want to have them here. And so I'm like in this space that there isn't really education for me within my community. It's this liminal space. I'm not even always sure exactly what my job description is. And yet I'm committed to doing it because I know that you can't become the things that you can't see. And like when I was growing up, when I had my bat mitzvah, I could never have imagined a woman speaking from the pulpit and giving a sermon. Like it literally was just something I couldn't imagine. And now like the little kids who are growing up in this Orthodox congregation, like are going to think it's totally normal. And like, it's slow change and it's painful for some people. And I recognize that. And it's also sometimes painful for me. I wonder if I'm just kind of like supporting and enabling a system to exist that like is hurtful to a lot of women. And yet I'm trying to like stay within and give back to the community that I love, that I grew up in, that I care so much about, genuinely love, and help it be the best possible version of itself. And it's sometimes a messy process and sometimes leads me to like end up at a Christian divinity school. But it's been a real adventure. And when I think about like what role this me being here has in my journey and my, I guess, like faith experience, but also like sense of responsibility to my community, is I feel like I'm coming to get the wisdom that I can where I can get it, of like the pastoral training, of preaching, of like academic study and knowledge, and bring that back to my community so that the girls who now grow up, and the boys who now grow up, and everyone who now grow up as Orthodox Jews can see that things don't have to just look like one thing. That's the hope. We'll see. We'll see if that happens.
It's interesting. Like I think many times when I've taught undergrads at various institutions, um, public universities, private universities, um, intro to Hebrew Bible courses, there's always a kind of, faith challenge moment, um, where people have to reckon with a way of reading a text through a sort of historical critical lens um, that forces you to read it outside of a certain set of assumptions about that text. And it can bring about real crises of faith. Um, and I wouldn't say that, it brought me to a crisis. Again, it's because what we might think, how we might translate sort of like maybe a Christian notion of faith for us is history, right? There's sort of like the history of the Jewish people is like part of how we might, construe ourselves as a community today and in the past, and all sort of linked together in a chain. And so when you start asking those kinds of questions about Sinai, and you ask questions about the historicity of the texts, it can bring you to a place that leads you to think I can't keep practicing. And I think that one of the things that I've always thought is how you practice as a Jew for me has very little to do with what I understand about the texts. And was it? I actually once played this video of James Kugel for an intro course where what does he say? Uh, I don't believe in the Torah, I believe in God. Which to me is still that's I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about these things. But I think that again, the reason I'm not practicing, I'm not doing all these practices is I think because I don't feel like I belong in a community. I think that practice is actually very much tied to how you feel connected with others, at least Jewishly, because all of these things are done together. You cannot have Shabbat alone. You cannot have a Seder alone. You cannot have a minyan alone. You cannot do these things alone. And I'm okay where I am right now. I'm okay with it. But I do know, and I've recognized since having a son, that I'm pressed more and more back into the community. So my sort of exile from the Jewish community may be coming to an end because I feel an obligation to bring him back in, to bring him into it. We had a bris. For me, it's really funny because my husband probably thinks that I'm nuts about these things, but when it comes to major life cycle moments or major moments that I sort of situate as very sort of central to my identity as a Jew, I always lean towards more Orthodox practices, even though I was like, I'm not keeping kosher, I'm not keeping Shabbat, because those things I think are not part of the practices I've outlined for myself. So I'm definitely one of those like buffet style Jews.
So I'm so intrigued by this framing, and I think it's so helpful of thinking about the role of community in keeping Jewish practice. And I think this is something that like the rabbis totally understood, and when they crafted rabbinic Judaism, I think they made laws and regulated things in such a way that, yeah, Judaism has to take place within a community. And then to hear you also mention family. And I think that's a very lived experience of people that when they have children, that brings them kind of like more, makes them more traditional or do more kinds of practices. And it's just so interesting because I feel like I've been on both sides of that coin of like recognizing that in kind of like an observant Jewish setting, the emphasis is on community and on family. It idealizes a certain kind of family, which is like being married and having kids. And then for me, the experience of feeling so connected to the Orthodox community in my case, but then having a family life that doesn't fit in kind of like this picture of what it means to be Jewish, right? Like divorce is not something, I mean, it's not really like chill anywhere, but it's definitely not, super chill in the community that I came from. And then having that experience of loneliness, and people who aren't in families feel very disconnected often from their Judaism and like Jewish experience and Jewish practice. And I just find that like a very, maybe, I don't know, I can't speak to like other religions so well, but like a very uniquely Jewish thing, because it really pulls to kind of not, it's not about my personal faith experience. That's not the way most Jews I know talk about their Jewishness. It is about this history, family, community element.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about, it's interesting that you've also had an Orthodox divorce. One of the things that will always stick with me, well, I also found sort of, I remember it was not a pleasant experience by any stretch of the imagination. It's almost like a wedding in reverse, right? Where it's like, megureshet, you're like
you're times that you are a divorced woman. Yeah.
But it's also like, like you are banished. After the whole thing was over, when, the rabbi was saying goodbye to me, he said, I hope you find your people. And I think I could have taken that like in a bad way, but I think he meant it genuinely, as in, I hope you find a family. I hope you find a family for yourself. And I can take that not charitably and think, as a woman, I can exist without a husband. Like, I'll just put that out there. I don't need this. But again, it's just sort of hardwired that what it means to exist Jewishly is to exist within a family. And I hope you find your people. Well, I did find my people, so happy now.
For all of y'all who are listening and are like worried about me, I'm good. I'm getting married in May. Like, I'd be good, okay, and I'd be okay anyway, right? It's so interesting, right? Like you said, like, why is it that I need to be married to be okay? And coming to like terms of the fact that, like, as a single woman, like, there is a wholeness there that I can come to and find, and at the same time, being a wife and then hopefully future a mother and being part of a family has religious resonance in a really
it's like interesting, because there's so many times in which I reject the ways in which those roles are construed, and I think a family is what you make. You make your own family, and however you make that, I think it's wonderful, and everyone should do what is most meaningful for them, and gives them the most joy and sense of wholeness. So I have no sort of ideas of like what is the correct way to have a family. Like, absolutely not. And in fact, I think that you can read the texts and see that too. That you can read the biblical texts. I love these sort of this is another reason why I love doing this, because there are so many counter readings that you can do, because the ancient world was just as complex as our world was. It perhaps in different ways, but the variety of human experience is there too. It's just not, in any case.
Amen.
Yeah. It's funny because we did not speak about faith at all, really, but I think that
only to counter what our experiences were to like say, but yeah.
Or it's like, I think that one of the things that I had put a sort of bookmark to make sure that I say is that, every single moment in the life cycle within the Jewish community for me, right? My bat mitzvah, my first wedding, my divorce, my next wedding, my son's bris, I never had occasion to profess or examine my faith, right? I always felt like faith was really treated as ancillary to specific practices and to performances of community inclusion, right? That I don't know if this is the case for you. Like, it would be interesting for me to hear if, within, a more observant world, if faith is treated as central. But my sense is no.
It's not. It's fascinating. I think it was often used as like a throwaway example, like that you should have emunah, right? Faith, that's like the Hebrew word for faith. Like you should have faith. But like, I guess I didn't quite understand really what that meant. And it just struck me once I started teaching at a pluralistic school that was named after one of the greatest Jewish theologians of the last kind of like century, that like I never talked about God. Like, ever. Like, nobody in my community really like talked about God, like what is God and what does it mean to have a relationship with God, and what is like, never. People talked all the time. You would say like, oh, how are you? You'd say like, oh, Baruch Hashem, right? Like, praise God, like I'm good. Like it was a throwaway and it was assumed. It was never talked about. And for me, it was, I mean, I think some people just have the God gene and some people just don't. I just like, I've always had, it's not even something I consciously engage with regularly because it's not really actively a part of the way most Orthodox Jews live their life. But like, I believe in God and I know that I feel and know that God has been with me, and have, as of late, started thinking about like theology and Jewish theology and what are those implications. But lots of people don't. They really don't.
Also, it's just, I feel like it's not socialized. It's just not part of, and I think one of the points that I would like to make is that, as a scholar, right, of the Hebrew Bible and of, biblical literature, the fact that it's not been central and it's not something that I think about, it also is, differently structuring the kinds of questions I ask. Because I'm not going to ask those kinds of questions because I'm less hung up, or I'm less interested, or, I'm always interested in people. How are people living their life? And
it's so fascinating to hear you say that, because we did talk about, how did we not talk about God? We learned the Bible, God's in the Bible everywhere. But I think it was a pretty unidimensional, very Maimonidean picture of God. So like very transcendent, very non-physical, and it was very vague. And then like, I remember when that changed for me, because I was on some panel at some point after I had already started teaching at Heschel, and my thought about these things got a little bit more nuanced. I was at a panel and somebody asked, like, if you could speak to any character from the Torah, like who would you want to talk to? And all the people on the panel before me said, like Moses, or like, oh, I want to talk to like, Rebecca. And I'm like, I want to talk to God. And I literally gasped, because the question is, who in the Bible would you want to talk to? And God's not a character in the Bible. Like that's like that, I would have never thought to say that. And yet when I relook at the Bible from like a different, maybe more theologically minded, like more God aware perspective, like God is absolutely an active actor, like character participant in the stories, and doesn't always act the same and doesn't always act at all. And there's so much richness there that's been uncovered for me by actually thinking about God in a serious way, that just was not present in my education or upbringing. And I understand why. I totally understand why, right? Like you mentioned how like the experience of students learning Bible from these other kinds of perspectives, particularly source critical, has led to real crises of faith. Like when you're raised to believe in a very particular thing and your whole religious experience and practice is founded on assumptions like God and, authorship of the Torah and authority of text, like And once you start questioning that, like things can really, really risk falling apart. And
yeah, you have a real Spinoza moment, you know?
Spinoza was, oh my God, I remember the first time I learned about who Spinoza was. I remember exactly where I was. And I was like, what is this? And it's been really interesting to go on these intellectual journeys and always want to come home, right? Like I always want to come home to my Orthodox community and family and feel part of it. And I really, really do. And also once you learn these things, I mean, that's literally the definition of woke, right? You've woken up. You can't like close your eyes to these. And it applies to like so many areas. It applies to the way that I experience my Jewish identity. You mentioned like the very, very beginning, like identity and race and what it means to be American, like these things and God and theology, like these things have become so much more nuanced for me. And it does sometimes feel like I'm not in exile, but my body's in the right place and my heart's in the right place. But sometimes my mind is thinking that don't really fit whatever else is happening around me. Which is, things interesting.
I'm just so curious. What is the response of your community to the fact that you are studying at a Christian divinity school?
So it's been overwhelmingly positive, mostly because I don't know. I didn't know what a divinity school was until I applied to come to one. I don't think most people in my community necessarily know exactly what what it really means to be in divinity school. The way I explain it is like it's smicha for Christians, right? It's like rabbinic ordination. And they're like, what does that mean? I'm like, don't worry about it.
It's like it's not, but okay.
It's super positive. And then the people who, it's interesting because I've actually found like the people who understand what it means and who know that it means I'm like studying Bible outside of like a traditional context, or who know that I'm studying Christian theology. The people who know what that means, who are attuned and who are looking for someone to talk to, whose mind is in the same place mine is, even though their body and their heart is in the same place mine is. It's almost like a code word. Like people come out of the woodwork and they're like, can we talk? And I'm like, I know what you want to talk about. It's really interesting to like find people in my community who want to be Orthodox and are there and are fully part of it, and also are troubled and question the same things that I am questioning and thinking about. And it's actually been so validating for me, and I think also for them. Like as a religious leader, if I'm here and I'm studying these things, like it can be done. And I hope that that's like hopeful for people. But I also think the fact that it's Yale like makes everybody not care about whatever school comes out. You're at Yale, like, oh, that's fine, great.
You're at Yale Rabbinical School.
We've just renamed YDS. I don't know how comfortable everyone would be with that.
This has been a Fireside Chat, featuring Professor Jackie Vaintrub and student Ora Weinbach, sponsored by the Spiritual Formation and Practice of Faith Committee. Thank you for listening.